Welcome to the WAVY Digital Desk. We're here for election night, and our coverage is continuing from the on-air studio into this digital studio. We're going to be with you for the next hour, so please follow along. If you want to join the chat, head over to Facebook. We're going to be monitoring that. We're going to throw some questions in there to get you to participate and hear more about your election day experience. I want to introduce who we have in the studio today, so I'm going to bring all their cameras on so you can see their faces with us today. But they're actually in the digital studio. You've seen them on air if you've been watching this evening, and you will also see them later this evening on WAVY TV. But to start, obviously, we have WAVY's anchor, Tom Shad, who's with us in sort of the break from the on-air coverage. He is now with us in the studio. So thank you, Tom, for hopping in here for a little bit of a different platform.
It is my privilege.
Absolutely. And then I want to introduce our experts that we have here. We're really thankful for their input tonight. So please utilize the chat, ask your questions, and hear more. To start, we have Ben Molesky, Associate Professor at Old Dominion University, professor at, that's been with us, I want to say, for many election nights. And this is just the next, and we're so happy to have him. And then also Rebecca Bromley Trujillo from Christopher Newport University, Research Director there as well, and she is our polling expert amongst other things. So we're so excited to have them in the room. But I just want to get started to throw it over to Tom. He's going to give us a little bit of an update on what's happening in the newsroom and what the latest is. Tom?
It's a crowded newsroom tonight, Sarah. I mean, it's a pizza night, if you will. Everyone is here working. Usually it's not as crowded at this time of day as it is right now because it's a very big election. It's an off-year election, but a lot of people are watching this. We've talked for days, months, weeks. We've seen the ads about how Virginia is going to be the bellwether, is going to be watched all over the country for a possibility, a little insight into 2024 and the presidential race, which that itself carries a lot of baggage. So you can imagine how people are trying to get some inkling of where the electorate in general is going to go, and Virginia does represent that kind of state rather well. We are watching some very key races tonight. Of course, the 24th Senatorial District. Andy Fox is covering the Diggs-Mason race, the Monty Mason, Danny Diggs race, the Senate District 17, Brewer and Jenkins. That I think Chris Horn is out there tonight for that race, and the House District 97, Karen Greenhall and Michael Fagans. Raven Payne is there for that race. So those are the ones we really focused on tonight. I believe I heard Joel Rubin say in one of our earlier newscasts that the House 97 is pretty much going to be a bellwether for the House because Glenn Youngkin won that by about 1.5 points during his gubernatorial election, and so that can go either way. And the Senate District number 24, the Mason-Diggs race is going to be closely watched for the Senate. So with that, let's bring in our panelists now. I'm done with my monologue.
Not at all. We asked you for the update. There's a lot happening. We'll keep you updated throughout the hour. If you see us sort of checking iPads, computers, phones to give you the latest. So we're really in the studio with you waiting for these updates. Thank you for that. And we're going to hear from, what Tom just said, Brett, Chris, Andy, sort of updates on, what's going on. You can also follow along on Twitter. I know they're keeping everyone updated there. But let's, I wanted to set the stage to start. I think a lot of people know that this is an important election from Virginia, as Tom said, how many eyes nationally on Virginia. But, Ben, to start with you, can you just tell us a little bit about why this election is so important just for Virginia? Like, what is open? What's on the ballot?
Yeah, so when we think about what's taking place in Virginia tonight, I mean, this is a midterm state legislative election year. So it's an odd one, right, in terms of the pantheon of elections that are out there. I mean, we always think about the presidential election years as being the biggest. Then comes the midterm election years in Congress, and we have gubernatorial election years. This is one of those kind of, sometimes it's called sleepy election cycles, right? But the reality is all 140 state legislative seats are up, right? So 100 in the House, 40 in the Senate. And with that comes potential for control, right, of the chambers, which then has policy implications for everything from abortion to education to guns to mental health care, you name it, it'll be driven by essentially who's in control there, or could lead to a little bit more gridlock and a lack of action on those issues. But then beyond that, right, we also have about 1,450 odd local races taking place across the Commonwealth as well, too, from city councils and boards of supervisors and school boards and things like that. Oh my goodness. And then you put this all in terms of then the context beyond this, right, is all eyes literally are on the Commonwealth, because there's elections taking place elsewhere in the country right now, right? The voters in Ohio are dealing with constitutional amendment as it relates to abortion. You've got gubernatorial races in Kentucky and Mississippi. So there's a lot of stuff going on, but people are looking at Virginia because of how the state has been changing over the years, right? It's historically used to be this red state, right? Then they kind of transitioned to purple. Then the Democrats had unified control, so it was this potentially blue state. Then Youngkin took it back and suddenly became a purpley state again. And people are saying, is this the roadmap for what 2024 may look like?
And then you talk about 2024 because then you throw in this little wrinkle into the ointment, basically, that you have Glenn Youngkin at a 55% approval rating, according to the CNU poll back on October 17th, a Republican, and we have Donald Trump, who is under indictment, who's being tried for various crimes, and people in the Republican Party looking at Glenn Youngkin to possibly rescue the party for the presidential election. So you have that as well. And he has not given an answer on what he wants to do. Andy Fox had him on live, I think it was 2 days ago, on Monday, where he was interviewing him for 5 or 6 minutes and asked him 3 times, would you run for a higher national office? And Governor Youngkin just repeatedly said, I want to do what I can for the state of Virginia, what's best for the state of Virginia, and we'll see, basically, leaving his door wide open. So you add to that the drama and the turnout for abortion. Let's get to that. And I want to start with you, Rebecca, about
Sure.
the latest polling results on abortion, why it's so important in this election.
Yeah, so there's really a few angles here. I mean, the Wasson Center did some polling on top issues for voters and on specific aspects of abortion policy as well. And so what we're seeing is that abortion is a top issue for Democrats. A majority of Democrats are saying that is their number one top of mind issue. When you look generally, including, of course, independents and Republicans, it's an issue number 2 or 3 for those. So it's clearly a major issue. When you get into the nitty gritty of what do people really want when it comes to abortion law, it gets pretty complex very quickly. So you just start at kind of the broad picture. Do people want Virginia's abortion law to change? When you ask that sort of base level question, you tell them current Virginia abortion law allows abortions through the 2nd trimester. When you get further, you've got to get some doctors on board saying that the health of the mother is at risk. And so you tell people that's what it is now. Do you want to see it staying as is? Do you want it to get less strict, or do you want it to get more strict? And what we find in our polling is that people don't really seem to want it to change. 49% say keep it the same. Mm-hmm. Another 23% are saying actually less strict. And then just that 24% are saying more. So when you take that question, it seems like, okay, people don't want this to change. And so that's abortion. Maybe that's a winning issue for Democrats. But then you've got Governor Youngkin coming in and taking a very different tact on this issue. So in other races, we see the midterm congressional elections, Republicans are running away from this issue, just avoiding it, not talking about it. Some even said burying their heads in the sand.
Since Roe v. Wade was overturned.
Yes, right. So since this major Supreme Court decision, we see a sudden shift in how that issue is being played out by Republicans. And Youngkin comes in and is saying, no, we're not going to hide from this. I'm going to come out and say I am for a 15-week abortion limit, as he says, rather than the ban language, and have these exceptions for rape, incest, health of the mother. And so this is a different tactic, and really this is a question, or it's a test. Is this a way for the Republican Party to talk about abortion? These elections will tell us.
Is it risky, Ben, for him to do that? Because Republicans traditionally would not do something like that.
Yeah, it's kind of, there's 2 folds to this, right? The first is that Governor Youngkin's not on the ballot, right? So he is very much taking a perspective that he can go out there and talk about this, and he's trying to put it on him, right? This kind of conversation. It's not so much about the people in the party that are running. It's about him talking about kind of his plans in the next session, right? However, there is a significant risk to that, right? The old adage was, if you are talking about your opponent's kind of like key piece, you're losing, right? You know, if you're having to talk about something they're winning on, you're already losing. So we're going to see, right? Like, can Governor Youngkin reframe something that is traditionally a Democratic issue, right? Is it traditionally a Democratic stronghold? And, you know, frankly, it's a risk, but if it pays off, that is a significant gamble that could work in their favor.
Now, 27%, I believe, according to the Wasson poll, of all voters did put the economy as the number one issue. If you look at both parties, not just Democrats or Republicans.
Absolutely.
So that's still, once again, the pocketbook issues, inflation, jobs have been coming back. Since, and also we've been seeing more jobs coming to Virginia. Governor Youngkin has bragged about that in recent months. But again, it's the inflation. And so how do you make that a state issue?
Yeah, so there's a lot of different ways you could. And when I have seen candidates in these key races talking about the economy, for Republicans, they are saying, hey, this is a big inflation problem that's caused by Biden. That's the messaging primarily from Republicans. They're also saying on the economy, to save people money, we need to reduce taxes. So that's kind of the Republican angle. For Democrats, you're seeing them talk about cost of living and suggesting things like affordable housing or childcare subsidies. So it's still a pocketbook issue, but it's coming from a different angle. How can we save people money in these other ways where costs are high? And so really it's on the economy. I mean, Republicans tend to be seen as better on this issue in the state right now. So if that's a main driving issue, it may benefit Republicans. If Democrats can kind of find a way to come at it from a different angle that voters support, well, then maybe they could win on that. But honestly, I think the economy is a better issue for Republicans right now.
And is that something that you think they're using as a stronger point than focusing on the abortion? Or does it weigh like that for voters? Or voters looking at it on that scale?
I think in some districts they are. And what's really interesting to me is that I've noticed not all Republicans are running on the economy, and in ways maybe they should be, but some of them are more focused on other issues like crime or that sort of thing. But I do think with the messaging of we want to lower your taxes and we are blaming Biden for the poor economic conditions, then that's an effective message that a lot of voters are responding to.
And crime, as you bring up, is a local issue, not really a state issue per se,
Sure.
but a local city issue. So
Absolutely.
wouldn't that have more resonance with voters?
Well, I mean, you take a look at the Hernandez-Pittman race that's going on in Norfolk City, and that was a key issue in the race. I mean, you heard both candidates essentially talking about it, but more so kind of Pittman driving kind of crime, tying it to his Democratic incumbency. But it doesn't resonate everywhere in the state, I guess I should say, right? You know, there are certain areas where it'll play a little bit better. It's tricky, right? I mean, this is the hard part.
It requires some thought.
But it's the hard part of issues,
yes.
right? I mean, talking about something like the economy, right, is like there are layers to that onion, right? Are we talking about, the economy as it relates to state versus federal, right? Is this something that's Biden's fault, but at the same time, Youngkin's trying to say, hey, look at all the wonderful things I've done here in Virginia. It's tough to say things are bad, but at the same time, they're good, right? And then who do you blame for if it's bad, right? Do you blame a random legislator for the fact that gas is now more expensive, or your eggs are costing you, back in the, at the height of it, a couple of, multiple dollars a dozen, right? So blame attribution is a very difficult thing for the electorate to do. So then, we think about, how sticky are these issues, right? Some issues are easy issues to wrap your heads around. I mean, abortion is an easy issue, right? Like you can say
It's very personal.
Yeah.
Yes, absolutely.
I mean, I always joke with my students in the classroom, we call these, again, easy issues because, if I say the word abortion, you get that kind of guttural response, right? It's like saying DMV, right? Everybody knows how they feel about the DMV, right? But when you start talking economics, right, and beyond just kind of like your pocketbook, you start talking, bonds and mill rates and things like that. You start getting into financials and the economy. Then like students' eyes start to glaze over, the public's eyes start to glaze over, because that's what you elect representatives to do, right? To go up there and kind of take care of that stuff, and you don't have to think about that. So it's a harder issue to wrap your heads around, even though we look at it and we're like, oh, it's the economy, stupid, but not always.
1992, right?
Yeah.
That's that.
Yep.
I do want us to pivot over, if we can, just to talk a little bit about the important races that we're looking at tonight. And just real quick to give an update, and starting with Andy Fox, who is at Monty Mason's campaign party. There is a question there, and we can get into this in a second, about those votes cast today from same day registered voters. And I guess we'll see what happens with that. But, just to start, can we just talk about some of these key races that we're watching out for tonight?
Yeah, I mean, so I'll go off my kind of list here. I mean, this Rebecca and I were kind of like, comparing notes. And it was funny, just like how many of the races were like, yeah, that's it, right? I mean, so the one kind of like race that, if you want to kind of like put your finger on the pulse of how the night may go, and I talked about this earlier in one of the news segments, is the 16th district, right? So this is the Henrico County, right? The western side of it, right? This is the Dunavant versus Van Valkenburg. So this was the incumbent, Dunavant, Republican, got moved because of redistricting.
Redistricting, exactly.
And it complicates so much of what we're talking about tonight into now a left-leaning Democratic district, right? So if you kind of look at what's going on there right now, we don't, then this is the hard part of election night also, is who's reporting, how much are you getting? VPAP is a wonderful source. They're having some issues right now. Everybody's hitting their site, right? But they're getting things under control.
Right now.
A lot of traffic, right? So, kind of just looking at kind of from the Virginia election site. I mean, so right now we're seeing Van Valkenburg ahead of Dunavant, but still close margins there. No early voting in at this point, right? So it's, all right, what do we do there, right? We look at the 17th district, right? This is the Brewer-Jenkins race. Very hard-fought clash race, two incumbents going head-to-head right now. Right now we're seeing, where are my votes at right now? Brewer is ahead of Jenkins. And if you look at kind of the interesting thing right here, Jenkins is ahead on the early voting, but Brewer is holding pace. And that's very good for her right now. Same with the mailed-in absentees, right? So Jenkins is ahead on that. On the current election day, Brewer's ahead of Jenkins by a sizable amount. So she's running well there, but again, very early. So we're kind of looking for indicators. Another race to kind of keep your eyes on is in the Senate, the 22nd district. This is the heavyweights rematch of the earlier this year, the Adams-Rouse rematch, right? Right now, Adams is ahead of Rouse, but no early voting in, right? So a lot of these, and then the 24th.
Early voting tends to favor Democrats.
Yes,
right.
But this election cycle changes things up, because this is the first time that we saw the Republicans turn towards early voting, trying to get their voters out there. However, the question is, if we're thinking about early voting versus same-day voting, are the Republicans essentially robbing from one to get the other, or are they growing the vote? And that's what we're going to be seeing essentially in the postmortem here. Were they able to grow the Republican vote in the early voting while still maintaining a strong election day presence? So
that's a great point.
Yeah. I don't want to suck up all the airtime here.
Totally.
There's so many wonderful things to say too.
Certainly, the only race that I would also add to what you're saying so far is the Diggs-Mason race is just going to be so tight. And I mean, we don't have any early or absentee voting in that race. So Diggs is ahead, but you would expect that. So just to kind of break it down for viewers that maybe aren't as familiar, election day voting tends to be more conservative, more Republican overall. On average, early voting and absentee ballots are more Democrat, but as my colleague said, Ben, I mean, you're right. Things are shifting. Governor Youngkin has advocated for Republicans to vote early. So we don't know exactly how that will impact those numbers, although we do have some sense of it from early data suggesting maybe those early votes are going to be still a Democratic edge, like maybe it's 60-40 versus what it used to be, like 70-30 or maybe even more Democratic. So it's interesting what we're seeing. Oh, and we literally just got some early votes. So it's still very close. But I mean, that race.
Which race are you talking about?
This is the Senate District 24,
okay.
The Danny Diggs Mason
I'm
race.
going to pull up, just so everyone knows on WAVY.com. We currently
wonderful.
do have it's 50%. And again, as they said, keep that with a grain of salt, really, as the numbers come in. But if you want to go on WAVY.com, I put this on the chat on Facebook as well. But this is constantly updating. You can see 2 minutes ago, 3 minutes ago. So see all of the districts right on here.
The numbers are
great,
literally
Sarah.
tight. The Diggs Mason race actually live in that district, and I can tell you that they are putting out heavy advertising, mailers galore. I had enough mailers by myself from my own mailbox to distribute like 50 of them to my class, my American politics class, and they're all digging through, looking at them because it's also CNU's district. And man, is that an intense race.
I think Andy reported earlier today they spent either was it $6 or $9 million in that race, both candidates. That's an incredible amount of money for a state Senate race.
And it's not just been the mailers, which the mailers are plentiful. They've also had a significant ground game.
Absolutely.
Right? I mean, living in the district, getting knocks on your door, it seems like every other day from either a Mason representative or a Diggs representative, here, take this, read this, right? And they have had a significant ground presence. And the candidates themselves, I mean, myself, I had Danny Diggs knock on my house door, right? And it was very fun to open your door and be like, oh, hi, candidate Diggs.
At least it wasn't Sheriff Diggs.
Right.
That's
very true. But I mean, this is what you kind of expect in a close race, in a modern professionalized race. You have to do this, right? You have to hit people at all angles, from both the flyers and the mailbox, which my poor mailman, I met him in the driveway the one day, and he said every day, because they're able to basically get entire blocks, and every house will get those mailers now. And quite literally, the mailers will say, candidate is pro this, and then the other mailer will say candidate is anti this, right? You're getting kind of both sides of the same coin.
Even in our technological age, people are still doing the mailers. They're still going door to door. It's still the shoe leather. It's still pressing the flesh. It's still shaking hands. It's pretty amazing that some things never change in politics.
Well, I did want to ask, Rebecca, on that. For polling purposes, it used to be word of mouth. We did see out there today some William & Mary students, actually volunteering to do the exit polls. But in terms of how you are polling, I mean, what are some of the methods right now?
Yeah, so polling, of course, is becoming more challenging in a multitude of ways. In the Wasson Center, we always do random digit dialing, so we're calling people, right? But certainly other pollsters are doing internet surveys, or they're mixing calling and internet. And so I'd say the biggest challenge is getting people to answer the phone. If more and more people do not have a landline, so they've got their cell phone, they see some number they don't know, they don't answer it necessarily. And so it takes many more calls to get the same number of people to talk to you on the phone. And so that's becoming more expensive as well. But I will say that you should not discount polling entirely. And in fact, Wasson Center polling has been very on point with elections. So we've been able to still continue to keep our standards up. It just takes more effort. It's harder. And certainly I can speak to more about how we do that. But it's a tough game these days.
And the sampling, I would think, would be very challenging to make sure you have the exact perfect sample. If you do like 1,100 likely voters, that has to be indicative of the entire race. How challenging is that?
Yes, so this is absolutely the most important part of polling, is that you need to get a true random sample to be representative of the population. And so to get into the nerdy weeds here of polling, I will say that, you start with this big number, right? You've got this list of registered voters. And if you're doing likely voters, you take it an additional step and you only select those that have voted in the last two elections in the last 4 or something of that nature. And then from there, you are truly drawing a completely random sample and you're random dialing. So any number on the list has an equal chance of being called. And that's how the math works. I get a lot of people saying that, how can 800 Virginians represent millions?
That's where I was going.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yes. And I will tell you, the math works. I promise you. Absolutely. If you're doing it well, you're going to get a random distribution of Virginians. And we can check this. So it's not just we're telling you, take our word for it. you can look at our demographics. You can see that the regions are properly represented based on the population from those regions. You can see that we use some statistical methods, survey weighting, very important, that make sure that we are covering different racial groups, different levels of education, different age groups. So we are trying very hard to capture that proper distribution.
And the thing I always tell my students, and people are always looking like, how, 1,100 people, that can't be accurate. If you cook and you make a pot of soup, we always taste the soup before you do it, right? But before you taste the soup, what do? You stir that soup up, right? So it's all well mixed. And then you take one little spoonful and you know how the entire pot tastes. That's it, right
Yes.
there. As long as it's well mixed, one little spoonful tells you how the rest of the pot is.
Absolutely.
I did want to pull in real quick. We don't have any results yet, but this is one where, there actually is a little bit of check marks coming in, actually. So if you scroll down here, you can see for Graves, I know this might not be a surprise given Norfolk,
Yeah.
but
right.
it's 76.56% to be exact, 97% reporting. So again, we don't have any, exact word or anything, but I'm just trying to see what is sort of coming in, and 97% reporting there is quite a
That
bit.
looks pretty safe.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
absolutely.
I mean, especially when you don't even have a Republican on the ballot, right? It's just,
Yeah.
independent. and-
Exactly.
yeah.
But then we are getting some, they're mostly like 70% reporting, Sarah?
Yeah, and I mean, some even, can be as low as 7% reporting in, 0% reporting in. So it's definitely across the map. I know that we're looking at District 24 is that big one. Here, I'll put it back up on the screen, but we're seeing 62% reporting. Monty Mason just slightly ahead, not even by a full percent. So I think that's one where I know that we've been repeating ourselves throughout this half hour, really, but that's when we're gonna have to wait.
And this is going to be the hard part of the night is, the last several election cycles with the early voting and the mail-in voting.
The provisionals and everything.
Right. Historically, it was like people always say, well, why can't we just go back to, just one day? That made things easier on us, right? In terms of like, yeah, we
Went
know
to
what they
bed
want.
knowing who won.
Exactly. But, in kind of thinking about how voters vote, right? The expectation that you have to make time in this day to make it happen, right? So to expand the electorate, get as many people as possible that have the right to vote, to get them to vote, we've expanded this, right? It makes our job harder because now we have early voting that we have to wait, and the state is getting better at releasing kind of early vote totals quicker. We have the election day voting. We now have these provisional ballots that we have to deal with from either people that kind of show up at the polls and say, this is my polling place, and they're told, well, it's not, and you're saying, but I am, and
It's always that.
Again, redistricting causes a lot of problems there as well too, because your polling place may be completely different now, right? You may be in a different district, and now we have all of these people that are also being able to do same day voting, right? We're seeing this especially with a lot of students. Being able to, if you've kind of changed your registration to be your school where you're at, right? Now, or sorry, if you haven't done that, if you've just shown up at the university polling center, wherever, and it's your first time voting, you can register that day as well. Sorry.
And, I think the one last thing I wanted to bring up too, just as we're sort of heading into this next half hour, what are some of the things that we're going to be looking for as it gets closer to 9? I mean, are the races going to be called, even though we've been talking about provisional ballots in play? Is that something that we could expect tonight?
It really depends on the race.
Depends on which district, right?
Yeah, so if we're
Looking at your
talking,
crystal ball over here.
yeah, the districts that are not particularly competitive and that have fewer races on the ballot in total will come in quicker. So places where there are many races on the ballot, really long ballots, it's going to take longer. And then if they're tight races, as Ben indicated, then you're starting to talk about provisional ballots, which may not even be able to be counted until tomorrow if they're those same day registration folks. So we have a long road on the very tight races for sure.
Well, it's about 8:30, and we're going to let Tom get back to getting ready for the shows tonight. So you're going to be able to see him on air, and we're actually going to bring in Marilena Valores here, and she's going to be joining us for the next half hour, just to see what's new in the newsroom, and also let Tom get ready for the evening shows and all of the results that are coming in. So I'm going to throw it back over to our experts as we sort of dive into this next half.
Yeah, let's just, before I dash, what will this election really mean for 2024, depending what happens tonight? Just give, each little summary about that, what that means.
Sure. So I mean, there's some big takeaways for 2024. I'd say some of it is messaging. So testing messaging on abortion. If this is a winning election for Democrats, then Democrats will continue to focus on the issue of abortion. But if it's a winning issue for Republicans, and they've been successful in rebranding it as a 15-week limit that's a common sense limit, then that would be a message that you would see the National Republican Party take forward. And then certainly there are implications for Youngkin himself, of course, which Ben can speak to as well.
Yeah, I mean, we're going to be looking at this in terms of how well Youngkin was able to mobilize both the Republican Party as well as the fundraising arm, how well his brand basically spells out across the country, or at least in the Commonwealth tonight. There's going to be a lot of talk. Is he going to be jumping into the 2024 election? Or I think, he may be jumping into challenge Tim Kaine. We can talk a little bit for later with Marlene. So I think it's very much, this is setting up a lot of just what is maybe a dry run for 2024, right?
Absolutely. Yeah, a dry run. And of course, this has implications for Biden. If Democrats are struggling, that could suggest that Biden's brand is not particularly strong as well.
Yeah.
And I did want to bring along, Lena is in the studio with us now.
Hello.
And she is joining us with the latest from the newsroom. So before we get started on the next half hour, Lena, can you just tell us a little bit about what is happening out there? What is everyone looking at? Is there anything that you can point us to?
Yeah, right now everybody, Sarah, is really just looking at the numbers coming in, like we are all here doing. People across the Commonwealth are doing, watching those numbers trickle in slowly but surely. You have some precincts that seem to move faster than others. Of course, that happens every year. So that's where we're at right now, and we're planning for our later newscast, looking at the numbers, looking how we're going to put that on later tonight. But we do have crews in the field. I know you guys have talked about it a little bit, but Andy Fox is on the Mason-Diggs race, and he talked to Monty Mason maybe about 20 minutes ago or so, who talked about how many students at William and Mary were out there voting and how impressed he was by that from Monty Mason. That's his alma mater. A lot of provisional ballots. I know you guys talked about that a little bit. And he's reporting he's hearing potentially 750 votes from students that may have voted provisionally. So Andy is on that race. Brett Hall is at the Virginia Democratic Watch Party in Virginia Beach right now. And from campaigns I've covered, and you all have probably seen this, oftentimes the Democrats in Virginia Beach will gather in one place and the Republicans will gather at the other. So Brett there is waiting, obviously, for the Fagans and Greenhall race. Fagans was there for a little bit, went back into his war room. Brett also said there are signs for Aaron Rouse there, obviously the Rouse-Adams rematch that we have. And then Alex Askew is there, and he ran uncontested, so he is the winner there. And then Chris Horn is at the headquarters for Clinton Jenkins. The Emily Brewer event was closed to the media. So that's kind of the latest in our newsroom and where everybody is and what they're saying to us right now.
Thanks for those updates.
Yeah.
And 750, can you, is that a lot? Can you explain how that number sort of fits in there?
Yeah, if you're just kind of looking at the numbers right now that are in, so pulling off VPAP right now, so we're looking at all right, so Mason, at least according to VPAP right now, is at 51.36%, whereas Diggs is at 48.38%, right? So if you just look at the percentages, all right, a little bit of a separation, right? But if you break down the total number that are in, right? So Mason has 18,396 to Diggs's 17,330. 750 votes if they are going mostly for Mason. That's a significant change there, right? So it's like that can even bump them up even further, right? We're talking about so 700. So that's like a percentage point right there, just that could be left out till tomorrow.
Mm-hmm. And again, this is something Andy is reporting from the ground, so exact numbers might not be 100%.
Oh, sure.
That information is, you guys know, it's so fluid, especially this early in the night.
Right.
Yeah, and for a race as tight as this one is expected to be.
Yes.
I just want to give a little update for anyone joining us for this half hour as we go until 9. You know, in the last half hour, we talked about a lot, but, you know, polling methods have been a part of the conversation. We talked about it, one of the big issues this election cycle, abortion, talked a little bit about some of the big races. I mean, there's a lot more to cover. There's a lot you could dive in with each of those topics for an hour itself, I'm sure, you know, within election season. But, you know, just to start this half hour, another thing that sort of connects with these big races, also where our reporters are tonight, is these advertisements that have been going all season. I think they cut off, I think we checked at 6:30 tonight. I think that might have been the exact last time.
Oh my gosh.
But, you know, just to talk about how important they are, what they mean. Rebecca, I don't know if you want to start just with polling or anything with, do people get affected by these advertisements? I mean, what are you seeing?
Yeah, so I think I'm going to start with political science research. It's a little nerdy, but, you know, I enjoy that. So when it comes to research, negative advertising actually is demonstrated to be more effective in competitive races. And so it's interesting because voters often say they don't like negative campaigning and they really think it makes things unpleasant. But the evidence suggests that it impacts their vote more effectively. So it's not a huge surprise to see these really competitive races kind of digging into the dirt. And it's unappealing in a way, but it's also effective. So it's hard to argue with the campaigns kind of going that route.
And Lena, we've had a lot here at WAVY, and we've had a lot of examination, I guess, of them with Andy's Truth Tracker. I mean, I guess, what have you noticed, or, you know, in terms of those Truth Tracker pieces, what's really, you know, came out to you?
Well, it's amazing how many political ads there seem to be this year. And I know it's every election season. You get to election day and you're like, oh my God, a car commercial. Yeah, God, they're back.
What a relief.
But I think, you know, and Andy did a fantastic job with his truth tracker, as he always does. Because these ads are so fiery. I think the two stories that he did, and I would love to get your thoughts, that really stood out to me. There was the one, the Danny Diggs, Monty Mason one. Yep. I think that was the one that had to be edited or pulled. And then the other one was the Brewer Jenkins. Yep. And those two, I would love to know what you guys think. 'Cause those were something.
Yeah. So let's start off with the Diggs Mason one, right? So obviously the kind of the initial airing of the ad, if I recall correctly, implied that Diggs was connected to kind of the
Proud Boys,
the kind of January 6th, right? It was ultimately edited down. He still was, kind of focused on the January 20th in Richmond, the individuals that were there, right? So it was kind of edited down. It was, it's a very impactful ad, right? I mean, especially when we think so much about, around election season, right? Integrity of elections, strength of our democracy, right? We bring up January 6th, right? I mean, we think about the former president's various trials that are going on and the conversations around it, right? So the ad and kind of connecting the dot there with Danny Diggs is it's mudslinging, dark, whatever you want to call it, but it's there's a certain degree of truth of him being there and et cetera, right? The Brewer Jenkins race, this is one that's received even national attention for how nasty it's got. I guess is just kind of a nicer way of saying that. The one ad which really resonated with voters was the Brewer against Jenkins ad of the woman named, I believe her name was Mimi, and saying that Representative Jenkins physically assaulted her daughter and physically assaulted her, right? So very powerful ads in terms of the subject matter. But if we think about what these ads are doing, right, they are pulling at really tight heartstrings, right? I mean, when you start mentioning domestic abuse, right, that resonates very strongly. We start talking threats to democracy, that resonates very strongly, in a very patriotic electorate, right? So these things, they work because they pull at our heartstrings. And you see candidates using them because, as my colleague said, they do work, right? And they work because we expect candidates to play the flowery ads, right? The showing pictures of you at the dining room table of your kids eating cookies
Right.
and things like that, right? That's expected, right? And your supporters expect that of you. It's telling you things you already know, that this person's a wonderful person, etc. When you see that negative ad, right? What is that doing? It's playing into fear. It's playing into essentially kind of risk aversion. Kind of the easiest way I always think about it is like you get up in the morning and you check the weather, right? You open your phone, whatever. Oh, it's a sunny day. That's the last time you ever look at it, right? However, if there's a hurricane coming to the region, where do we go? We're constantly going back to the well because we're constantly thinking about the hurricane coming. There's a fear component to it. We can't stop looking at it. And that's kind of how negative ads work. They're playing on fear. They're playing on kind of negative emotions. And we can't help but look at them.
That's a really interesting way of describing it. Sarah, were you about to?
I was just curious. I mean, we've talked a lot about partisanship, especially in the last few election cycles. Does it even sway voters to the point? Is it the ones on the cusp that this is looking at? I mean, for people that are so pro-Republican, so pro-Democrat, does this even have an effect on them?
Well, I would say if we're talking about strong partisans, absolutely not. Will not have an impact. So there's kind of two arguments about what these are doing. Either they are motivating the base, so they're really firing up the people that are partisans already, so getting them to turn out. And that's one angle. And then there's the other, that maybe this is influencing independents or people that are really undecided. And certainly these ads could capture either of those. And I think in elections like this one, I think the turnout is the bigger deal. So how many people are actually coming out to vote? If it's a negative ad that really fires people up, I think that's going to be the most impact you're going to see from that.
And you can get firing up on both sides, right? There's
Absolutely.
the firing up of like the people like, oh my goodness, what just happened here? Like this is so terrible. I have to stop it from happening.
Yep.
And then you can get the supporters of the candidate that, or maybe tangential supporters that get riled up too. Like, no, that's that. They're lying about my candidate. I need to go stop that as well too, right?
Yes.
So it can work against you in some cases, right? Depending
Sure.
who you fire up.
Absolutely, yeah.
And in these commercials, they do tag along the issues of abortion. They talk about K through 12 education, which I do want to get into this half hour too, is, the look at schools. And I know that Lena can speak to this, but schools have been a big issue down here with school boards and, gun safety. And there's just been so much emphasis put on, the school board decisions, and that's also up for election tonight. So, what do you all make of this education issue? Is that one of the most important for people? Is that more directed just at parents?
I mean, I would say it's directed at both, because parents and non-parents care about education, even if they don't have children in the school. Like, it's a motivating issue, and it's kind of different angles depending on which party we're talking about. So, Governor Youngkin, when he was successful in his bid for governor, he really went after the parental rights angle of education and arguing that parents need more say in their child's education. And so that's kind of the more Republican messaging we're seeing as well with the candidates in these legislative races, trying to kind of repeat some of that success, whereas Democrats are approaching education from an angle of, we need more funding to address learning loss from the pandemic, we need to raise teacher pay, or these sorts of angles, and focusing on that. And so they both care, but they're definitely coming at it from different ways.
Yeah, and especially when we're looking at kind of Northern Virginia, right? These were districts that shocked people in the 2019 gubernatorial race, because they were districts that went for Biden.
Yeah.
And then you look at Loudoun County and parts of like Prince Williams, right? And these were areas that flipped. They went red for Youngkin. Now the question is, what's going to happen tonight, right? I mean, like House District 21, this is the Thomas Stirrup race. House District 22, this is the Lovejoy-Nebhard race. Like, what's going on here? Can education still drive people to the polls, or in some of these suburban districts, are we seeing abortion supplant that, which was the issue of 2019, now is abortion the issue of 2023?
It's interesting to see how things, I don't want to say go in cycles, but almost come up at different times and have different weights, and different issues change, and what is driving people to the polls now, will that be driving people to the polls in a year?
Yeah, I think that's an open question.
Because we also have so much time in between, right? It's this open window for events to happen. I mean, just last week, or guess now a little over a week, right? We had the shooting in Maine, right? So like, what did that do? I mean, we think about where gun control and guns were on your poll just a little bit ago. Has that changed in the intervening period, right? Like if you look at exit polling or something like that. So we've got a whole another year starting tomorrow, right? Oh, it's crazy to think, right? But like what, it's horrible to say, but what things will happen during the intervening year that will change people's opinion? I mean, Supreme Court makes decisions, the economy changes, wars take place, right? These things impact so much of our thinking and what kind of like bubbles up to the surface of kind of like that kind of the random processing element of our mind, you know, kind of like what are we thinking about in this moment?
Yeah,
And, you know, we didn't get into redistricting as much in the last half hour, but that's something certainly that could impact really what we're going to see tonight, but then also in a year from now. Is that something that, I mean, I'm sure that you all are looking at, but in terms of, I guess, just to start with knowing who these incumbents are, knowing your candidate is. Ben, I know that you gave me some stats on that, but you know, how big of a problem is familiarity?
Yeah, I mean, so this is huge. So if we think about the House, we had about 1 in 4 members retiring or changing due to redistricting. In the Senate, we had about 1 in 3, right? So, I mean, if you kind of think about this, incumbents, you know, there were some we lost due to being defeated in the primaries, right? So we had 5 incumbents that lost in the primaries, 1 Republican, 4 Democrats. We had a bunch of incumbents retiring because of this, right? So it's the largest number of retirements we've seen since 2011, so it's about 113% increase, which the average retirement is about 4.7 retirements per cycle. And, you know, we had, how many do I got? I've got my lists here, right? I mean, 3, 6, 9, 12. Like, I mean,
it's safe to say we've just blown it out of the water.
Right. I mean, so, I mean, this is the big thing is then, all right, so we have all these retirements taking place, and then we have issues where you've got candidates that were in the lower chamber, and as opposed to retiring, they're moving up to the Senate, right? And then we have races where they're competing against each other. This is like the Jenkins Brewers race, right? And the hard part for the candidates, the hard part for the parties now is because of redistricting. Who are the voters in your districts now? You can have some districts where you now have 30% new voters. That is a crazy number, especially if you're a candidate or you're trying to do your own internal polling and you don't even know who these people are. They don't know you as the incumbent anymore and you can't rely on them. So that adds essentially a wild card to your deck of trying to figure out who do I reach out to, how much do I have to spend, how much essentially capital do I have in the bank from goodwill that I've done before, how many new people do I have to introduce myself to?
A lot of factors.
Yeah, I can add just a little bit to that and say that, you know, redistricting shook up everything. And so fundamentally, we're going to have an entirely different General Assembly, regardless of what happens tonight. But of course, it matters what happens tonight. And so when I think about, you know, a specific race that, you know, some of our commentators are out there looking at, you know, the Diggs-Mason race, Mason's technically an incumbent, right? He was in the state Senate. He served in this district. That said, given the redrawing of the lines, a significant percentage of that district is new to Mason. I think it's about 30% new, or maybe a little under that. And so he is having to introduce himself to new voters. And Diggs is an interesting candidate as well, because though he's not an incumbent and he wasn't serving in the General Assembly, he was the sheriff for Pocosa and York County, which are part of this district. Mm-hmm. And so they certainly know who he is, and so he is benefiting from that familiarity. And so it puts him at a closer, even ground as far as familiarity goes. And so for Mason, that redistricting was pretty impactful.
And then if we think ahead moving forward beyond election night, with so many retirements, so many of these challenges, we've lost a lot of the political leadership in the chamber. I mean, you think about like the Normans, the Lewises, right, the Spurls, right? Like we've lost heavy hitters that drove policy in both chambers. And now what we're going to see is this kind of emergence of a new cohort of leadership, which adds, again, a monkey wrench for us trying to predict policy and what's going to happen because they have their own agendas. They have their own kind of constituencies that they have to lead to. So it's going to be a very interesting General Assembly.
Absolutely.
And in terms of, you know, what this does for Yunkin, you know, we've heard a lot of things. We haven't, you know, dove into that topic this hour, but you know, hold our House, flip our Senate. That's that chant that they sort of have going. What could this do for Yunkin and his policies, depending on how the night goes?
Yeah, so I mean, there's obviously a few different possible outcomes, but one of those is that Governor Youngkin and his party earn a trifecta, which would mean he's, of course, got the governorship, but then the Republicans would control the House and the Senate. If that were to happen, we would see a pretty significant rightward shift on a lot of issues: abortion, gun policy, environmental policy, voting rights. So that would be a huge impact on policy in this state. If Democrats maintain one chamber, then of course they're going to continue to do what we have seen, which is to sort of block some of the measures that are coming through from the Republican Party. If they get two chambers, still blocking some of the Republican agenda, certainly, but it does present them an opportunity to attempt to get constitutional amendments, because you only need the state legislature to take votes on potential amendments. So maybe they do something there. And so for Youngkin, I mean, it's big time impact on policy. And then we talked a little bit earlier in the hour about his potential for running for president, or his future in the state, maybe running for Senate or some other U.S. Senate specifically. So, I think it's a lot of implications for Youngkin.
Yeah, I mean, his political aspirations, he's kept very close to the vest, right? And this has very much been his campaign focus, using the Spirit of Virginia PAC to essentially prop up his legislature, very much focused on what he can do for the Commonwealth, focused on the elections here. There's a lot of hope within the Republican Party that he will be kind of this last-minute dark horse jumping in, unify the Republican Party against, Trump as like a candidate that could do that. The reality is we're 10 weeks away from New Hampshire. That's not a long runway. We start thinking about, kind of like actually making it to the ballot, right, in terms of ballot access. That gets much more complicated. There's potential that he says, well, no to the presidency now, and maybe runs against Tim Kaine. So Tim Kaine will be up in 2024. So it sets, a stable there. I mean, Tim Kaine has been a very strong candidate. I mean, you go back to 2018, he got 57% of the vote, right? So against Stewart, who got 41% of the vote, and against Waters, who was a libertarian, who picked up another 1.8% of the vote. But what does a very strong governor look like, right? What does a strong governor, and some of my own research has looked at strong governors, when they have a strong economy on their back, you run right then and there, right? Strike while the iron's hot. That's when governors are successful running for the Senate. That
would be an interesting. You mentioned the Youngkin potential Senate run earlier, and I actually had not heard that as a whisper, but everyone has obviously heard the presidential campaign as a whisper. But
absolutely,
the timing does seem a little bit short for that to happen.
It would be a really difficult hill to climb. It's some of the contests, the primary contests, he's already missed the deadline for getting on the ballot. So he would have to start with a focus on those, what we call Super Tuesday states, like the big push. And some argue he could do that. And I think what it would take is a huge win for his party in these races, because then he could say, I'm the person who can bring the party together and win in purple/bluish places. And that said, Trump is, really the name behind the Republican Party right now. And so it would be quite difficult for Youngkin to climb back up and get close to Trump or overtake him.
And the crazy thing is, our election night tonight is literally on the eve of tomorrow night's next Republican debate, right?
Yes,
so you have the next in lines behind Trump, right? Trying to vie for status and trying to coalesce power. I mean, Nikki Haley's kind of risen up a little bit there as well, too. So what does a Governor Youngkin do when you have this stable of other candidates that's kind of there, trying to coalesce power? Can he even break into that?
That's a great question. And there's, like you said, not a lot of time, but then a lot of time with a whole year to go. What do you think what happens tonight in Virginia? What does that show for your perspectives for what the country might be looking toward next year? Why is Virginia still a bellwether? How are you thinking about that right now?
It is and it isn't, right? It is in the sense that, I mean, it tells us a meaningful data point about how people are feeling about President Biden, how they're feeling about key issues that may appear in the 2024 races. I don't think abortion is going away. Supreme Court made this foundational decision that will keep that issue in electoral cycles for some time to come. But as Ben has said, new issues will crop up between now and presidential elections. So it matters what happens today in Virginia. I think it sends a signal about the effectiveness of the types of campaigns that Democrats and Republicans are running here, and the effectiveness of Governor Youngkin. But I don't think we can say, oh, what happens in Virginia happens nationally, because there's so much that can change between now and then.
Yeah.
And then the fact is, I mean, we are dealing with state elections here, and there is a bleed-in effect of, we could call these national coattail effects, right? So it's like what's happening in Israel and Gaza, what's happening in Ukraine, what's happening with kind of foreign aid versus domestic funding for, say, Hawaii, what's going on with the budget, which is, frankly, we're going to be dealing with very shortly here as well too. We've kind of kicked that can down the road with the most recent continuing resolution. And then, I think there's also effects of looking at the Republican Party in terms of what happened with the speakership, and is there internal strife taking place? And so there's kind of all these kind of other factors there that work their way into kind of Virginia elections, but they're not actually on the ballot. Whereas 2024, they will be on the ballot, right? That's a whole nother, we're moving into that ballpark.
That's interesting. So that separation between, what is at play either on a national or international scale, obviously doesn't come into play here. So that is something that we can't really account for, polling or not, this election. Mm-hmm. And I mean, for polling, I guess I'm just curious, for those national issues, is that something that you all are trying to see if that impacts local voters, or are you guys playing with that at all?
I mean, I would say the polling is suggesting, like with the economy, most people are thinking about the economy nationally, inflation nationally. Yes, it's affecting Virginians, but it's a national issue to a lot of people. And the truth is that state races are heavily nationalized these days. So it's certainly true that there are local issues, but more and more state races are referendums on the president, even though the president's not on the ballot and is not leading the state. So it's an interesting challenge. And so I think it's meaningful, and our polling is certainly suggesting that the generally national issue of the economy matters to voters. And, we'll have to see what that means looking at those issues in a national race, vis-a-vis the next election. But, yeah.
Absolutely. Well, as we get a little bit closer to 9 o'clock, and we're not there yet, but, there isn't a lot that's come in the last hour. And so is that something that at this point, we might be expecting it later on this evening? Is that something where there's been so many early votes, been so many same-day registration votes that, really for some of these closer races, we shouldn't really expect to hear anything from those big parties tonight?
Yeah, I think, for these close races, right, there are going to be provisional ballots we have to wait for tomorrow, especially, I'm looking at the 17th district right now, and they are separated by like 600 votes. And, so it's like, what's going to happen as the remaining precincts come in? What's going to happen as more of the early voting comes in? What do we do with tomorrow? So I think for kind of my takeaway is, don't make the pot of coffee. Don't stay up waiting for, kind of the Wolf Blitzers of the world to say, this election is won. I think, it's safe in many cases to go to bed and then look at your phone tomorrow morning, and then, maybe look at your phone tomorrow afternoon a little bit as well too.
I know we are starting to kind of wind down here, but I would love to know from both of you, what is the one big thing you're watching tonight? The big picture or the small picture it is, but the one thing that you're really curious to see how it happens tonight.
For me, it's abortion.
Yeah.
I mean, this is such a powerful issue. We've seen it, frankly, the last, since Roe fell. I mean, it's influenced election cycles. It's stymied Republican waves. It's an issue that, if you look at how the parties are kind of like positioned on the issue, and then where the public is. One of my colleagues was looking at this earlier this week, and kind of like ideologically where the parties are at. The Republicans are kind of up here, Democrats are down here. On that issue, the public is matching essentially the Democratic Party ideologically on it, and that is a very difficult thing for Republicans to run against. And it's not just a state issue, right? I mean, this is a national issue, and it's one that the Republicans are going to have a hard time fighting against.
Rebecca?
Yeah, I mean, I really do also look at abortion. I mean, it's not the only thing I'm looking at. Certainly, these are such tight races that control of either chamber is certainly in the balance. And so it's really a question of like, whose messaging has been effective, and abortion really matters, or it doesn't, but I think it's going to. And so the thing I'm looking at the most is abortion, and then just who is going to end up in control, especially the House, because that's the one that I think is the least predictable.
And that'll be interesting to see who takes those 140 seats, and if, Governor Youngkin can sort of push his agenda, as you all talked about, within the next few years. But, thank you both so much for joining us throughout the night. I know we're going to hear a little bit more from you on air as well. And Lena, thank you for stepping out of the studio into this studio. I think, hopefully we can see some more in your newscast tonight at 10:30, 11:30, and figure out a little bit more of what certain races at least are shaping up to be.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I think by then we should have some more numbers, I hope.
Yeah,
Hopefully.
we'll at least have some insight or expectations. Yeah.
Yeah, we'll take it.
And I want to just say to anyone watching on our platforms tonight, YouTube, Facebook, WAVY.com, all of this will be available on WAVY.com and Facebook and YouTube to watch later, to go back and hear some of the expert analysis and commentary. You can also go to WAVY.com all night long, look at election results, see what's coming in, stay up to date. I also will say follow along tonight on WAVY TV 10 and with our reporters out in the field. They're going to be out there at these parties and these very competitive districts this evening. And then again, I want to say in the morning, we're going to kick right back off with elections tomorrow morning when that morning team comes in. So make sure to tune in for that. Well, thank you all so much for being our panel this evening and talking about the election, but I appreciate your time and joining us at the digital desk.
Definitely.
Thank you so much.
So much fun.
Thank you both.
Thank you.